Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. If you're following this next general session out there on the World Wide Web via SYS-CON TV, APIs. Promised they'd be in day one. We want them left, front and center. Front, left and center? Who knows? It's your language. I just mess it up. A soup to nuts analysis by Alistair Farquharson, CTO of SOA Software. Please give it up for Alistair.
Thank you. Let me make sure this works. Here we go. So for those of you who do not really know what APIs are, we're really seeing a revolution around the APIs and the use of APIs. In fact, we're sort of seeing three different things when it comes to APIs. The first one is we're seeing how people are reinventing their digital strategies around APIs. In other words, they are taking an API and they're exposing an API to the outside world, allowing developers to consume the API and to open up new avenues of business and money making for their business. The second thing we see when we talk about APIs is we're seeing that SOA is being reinvented by APIs. I know a lot of people think that APIs and SOA are mutually exclusive, but we're seeing SOA being done using APIs. And in this respect, we're seeing application-to-application integration within the enterprise being done using APIs. And this is as a direct result of mobile applications and web-based architectures that leverage APIs. In the third place, we're seeing APIs reinventing, or the cloud being reinvented with APIs. And what I mean by that is that people are taking their data center, they're taking their cloud, whether it be internal or external, whether it be private or public or hybrid, and they are abstracting the cloud platform using a set of APIs, and they are building new next-generation applications on top of that API set. Call it a platform API, call it what you will, but the basic factor there is people are reinventing their businesses around APIs. So I'm going to talk a little bit about two things, well, actually a lot about two things. The first one being the API lifecycle, and the second one being an API management reference architecture. We are in the business, SOA Software is in the business of being an API management vendor. So I'm going to talk a little bit about what we think our product should look like and hope you agree with it. So first off, the API lifecycle. Obviously, you need to start with planning something. Once you've planned it, you build it. Once you've built it, you run it. But then there's two things that are not immediately obvious when you think about APIs and when you think about the SDLC process, and that is namely, how do you share it? And last of all, how do you actually analyze whether or not it's been successful? If you think of APIs as either a supporting initiative for your platform, or if you think of APIs as a new channel for your business, or if you think of APIs as a new way to do SOA, you need to be able to share those APIs with your organization if you have any hope of success, and you need to be able to analyze that success at the end of the day. Hopefully claim victory. Hopefully keep your job. So let's look at these different things one by one. First of all, an API needs to be a product. Irrespective of those three channels or those three different solutions that I spoke about, an API has to fundamentally be a product. The person who owns the API initiative within your organization needs to be a product manager. Not even necessarily a technical product manager. Maybe they're a business product manager. They understand how to package, how to market, how to share the API with the rest of the organization, and how to create an arm's length relationship between the people who are creating the APIs and the people who are consuming the APIs. This is the one big thing where I feel that SOA as a technology has failed us for the past 10 years, in that people never created a product out of a service. Services were never funded in their own right. They were never built by a product manager and brought to market by a product manager. Whether it was internal or external, between partners, you need to think of an API as a product and fund it as such and make it as part of your business. So, to be a product, you need to think of what the business purpose of the API is, and there's lots of different things that I've sort of spoken about, but you need to figure out how people are going to make money. What is the cost and benefit outcomes for the business and the intended user of the API? How are you either going to save money or how are you going to make money? And this means that there are probably fewer APIs inside your organization that you envisaged with your SOA strategy. APIs should be fairly conservatively built. They should only be built if you feel that there is a business justification and a need for it, and it should be productized. You should agree on the product priority and the delivery schedule for the API. That seems fairly obvious. And you should structure your business to support and manage the API. Again, this was one of the failings of SOA for the past 10 years, where services have been built as an adjunct to a project. And you say, as an enterprise architect, oh, why don't you service enable your application? And the guy turns around and says, with what money and with what time? And that's what derails any kind of service-oriented architecture that you put into place in your organization. APIs and the need for APIs and the advent of technologies that demand APIs really means that you can now structure your business and structure your financing to manage and support APIs in their own right. Then you need to build an API. I like to say you build it from the outside in. But what you really need to do is understand and articulate those requirements. You need to make sure that there's agreement between the key players within your organization or between your organization and its partners, even before the development starts. You need to separate functional and non-functional requirements out of your API infrastructure and develop, hopefully, or spend most of your time developing only the functional requirements. Then you need to iterate through that API development process. And this is one thing that people forget about a lot. It's easy to build an API, especially if you're a startup or you have a greenfield kind of environment. But what happens when you're building APIs and you're trying to build an API practice within your organization, and you have existing systems, and then, of course, things change, and you have new versions of your API, and then you have to monitor, oh, my word, I have 3 apps using this one version, and they belong to our most important customers. How can I change that API, and I have to run 2 APIs? So over time, your API program is going to evolve and become potentially more complex. You also need to, unless you have some glorious mandate, you're going to have to build APIs by leveraging existing investments. You're going to have back-end systems that are weird and wonderful in all likelihood, and everyone thinks that you can build an API very, very easily. But the problem is yes, you can, but in most cases, that API needs to talk to some back-end system. And you've got space-delimited messages on MQ, and you're trying to figure out how you're going to make a REST API out of that. It's complex, and you need to figure out how you're going to do that before you start building. Then once your API is released into the wild, you need to run it. No one's going to use an API, whether it's internal or external or between partners, unless it's protected, secured, and managed. So you need to be able to support those non-functional requirements in an API platform. And what I mean by this is you need to separate out those non-functional requirements so that you can centralize those efforts and lower the cost of non-functional requirements versus functional requirements. So most of you probably work for large organizations. You need to figure out, what is that platform going to look like? What is that API platform going to look like, where you protect, secure, manage, provision, share, collaborate about and around the APIs. You need to manage provisioning and app control or access control for those apps. You need to figure out how you're going to do monetization. You're going to need to figure out how you do lifecycle management and control of the applications and the APIs inside the infrastructure. And last but not least, you need to provide some kind of monitoring. How well is it doing? Has it stopped performing in the last 10 minutes? Has my partner all of a sudden gone from 500 transactions a second, which they normally do, to 3 transactions per second? And if so, why? Has something gone wrong that nobody's noticed? So you're going to need to provide API monitoring within the context of the infrastructure that you have for your APIs. Then you're going to need to share things. So you're going to need to publish, support, and syndicate this API. For it to be successful, if it's internal and you're using it for application-to-application integration, your goal is to lower cost by increasing reuse. To do that, you're going to have to publish and support that API within the organization. If you're using it for B2B to generate new revenue streams, then you better let your partners know about it, and they better have some way that they can actually communicate back with you. If you're exposing an API as a channel to the general public, to Joe Schmo in his garage, then you're going to need to be able to develop a rapport and communicate effectively with that person in a scalable way that you might not have had to do up until now. So you're going to need to effectively create a marketplace for your APIs or your API program. Whether it be internal, B2B, business to employee, business to developer, I don't know, but you're going to need to have some place where you can control the consumption of these APIs in a scalable way. You're going to have to interact with and recognize your API developers, whether it's through showcases, whether it's through badges, whether it's through the honor system, I don't know. But you're going to have to develop and interact with those API developers and attract new API developers. Even if it's internal, you don't want to build a bad API and hide it underneath the rug. You're never going to get any adoption. You need to appeal ultimately, at the end of the day, to the developer that's using that API. You need to create great documentation about the API and how to use it. You need to make testing against the API as easy as possible. And you need to figure out how, again, you're going to monetize your API and communicate that with everybody. Whether it be fine-grained authorization that controls parts of your API and you parcel it out to different partners for different dollar amounts, or whether you have quality of service constraints about your API that says, well, you can have so many a month if you pay this much dollars, and you can have an unlimited amount for an unlimited number of dollars. Whatever you come up with, it needs to be communicated to your consumer, and it needs to be effectively done and managed. Then last but not least, you need to analyze, hopefully, your success. You need to measure, you need to report, and ultimately you need to iterate. Your APIs, building the first one is easy. Building the second one is hopefully an improvement on the first one. And to get improvement, you need to be able to measure and report on the success of that program and get feedback from developers and see what they like and what they don't like and what they're using as part of your API and what they're not. And this provides reporting back to the business for the next versions of the API. It provides reporting so that you can do billing around monetization, and it drives the improvement back into the planning stages. So now what I like to do is talk a little bit about a reference architecture. So what are the components that you basically need to fulfill these different lifecycle stages? And they group together, at least to me, naturally as follows. Planning and building is part of what I call lifecycle management, what we call lifecycle management. Then the running or the execution of the API is done within a gateway. And then the sharing and the analytics around who is using it and how much use they're getting out of it, that is all part and parcel of a developer portal that you're deploying or managing within your infrastructure. So think of lifecycle management as the ERP system for this API factory. Organizations basically have two different options. They can decide that they don't want to do any lifecycle management, and that's fine if you have a small number of APIs in a simple environment. But most people, at least where I come from and the people I deal with, come from an enterprise environment, which needs a governed approach. A lot of people don't like using the word governance alongside the word API. But the fact of the matter is that you still need to deliver a decent product on time to the market. And to do that effectively and to do that repeatably, within an enterprise, you are going to need to control the life cycle, and you're going to need to manage what is being done and when it's being done. So that's called governance. And organizations that are complex, like our organizations, need a governed approach. They need a life cycle management capability. So if you think about, again, the use case where I mentioned that you have a B2B community, you're going to need to understand which of your partners is using which version of an API, what backend systems each version of the API is using, what data structures and what information models are being exposed to that API, where that information comes from, what policies are associated with it. And eventually you end up with a fairly complex set of interdependencies, asset relationships, so to speak. And you're going to need to use that to manage the impact of change around an API and to understand what is your committed service level and capacity to your different partners. Instead of just reacting every day, you can now finally plan if you have a lifecycle management capability. So let's think about the sort of things it provides. Approvals and workflows. Should I build a service in the first place? Has business signed off on it? Has legal signed off of it? Has QA signed off on it? These are simple approvals and workflow steps in your API development process. Costing. How am I going to actually cost out this API? How am I going to license it? When am I expecting to turn a profit? Different work stream alignments. You've got business, you've got product management, you've got documentation, you have legal agreements, and finally, maybe the least of all of these, you have the actual development of the API itself. Many organizations we work with, they really fall down when it comes to legal about an API. If I'm exposing an API to create a new business channel, I have to first educate my legal group on what an API is and what the risk is associated with it, and that can take months. So you really need to figure out what are the different work streams, how are they aligned, and you have to put them in the appropriate spots within the SDLC process. You need a way to model an API. A lot of people will say, well, an API should be free and undefined and reasonably loosely structured. But the problem with that is that you need to, again, manage change. It's fine if you create an API that supports upgrading. It's fine if you create an API that is flexible when it comes to change. But you need to understand what that is, and you need to be able to stamp a version number on an API. So you need to use different methodologies. If it's XML, maybe there's schema. If it's JSON, maybe it's JSON schema. You might use Swagger. You might use Waddle. There's a lot of different mechanisms for defining and modeling an API and its set of dependencies. And you will need to do that as an enterprise. Not everyone's a genius. There's a lot of people out there who can whip together a fantastic API, but that doesn't really scale very well. So again, if you have a large portfolio of APIs within your organization, you're going to need to somehow disseminate best practices and templates to the organization to make sure that they're building things appropriately and in the right way. You're going to need to figure out what your practices are as an organization around versioning and change management. Do I put a version number in the accept header? Do I put a version number in the URL? What do I do? Ooh. So you're going to need to figure these things out as you go forth and create an API. Then, of course, there's the gateway. Two models exist for the gateway. There's the proxy. Well, I'm going to just put a proxy in place. I'm going to do some basic monitoring. Maybe I'm going to do some authentication. And that basically summarizes a proxy. It's how do I take an API from inside my organization and expose it to the outside with some protection or maybe some authentication and authorization. The second option is what I call a full-on gateway, which can also proxy, but it really provides a lot of integration and mediation capabilities that you need in the enterprise. Likely as not, you have a lot of legacy kinds of environments and technologies and transports and protocols and standards behind your firewall. And you're going to need to mediate between those and the API that you actually want to put out into the wild. So how do you do that mediation? How do you do that orchestration? How do you execute those scripts? There's got to be a gateway or a platform that can actually help you get your API out there without you being beholden to the SDLCs and the little projects that are going on internally. If you're trying to expose an API, you need some flexibility to decouple yourself and your API program from internal project dependencies. If I had to turn around and ask my mainframe guys to please expose a REST API, I'm going to get looked at very strangely, and it's probably going to take 2 years. So you really need to figure out how you're going to provide that mediation and abstraction layer. Other people have other priorities and you have yours. You need something to be able to mediate and orchestrate and build your API on. Kinds of things in a gateway. You need process composition and orchestration, which is going to improve your time to market, as I said. It's going to provide you with security. It might be OAuth. It might be OpenID Connect. It might be a lot of different kinds of WS security protocols if you're using WS security for XML, SOAP kinds of APIs. So the security mechanism that you have within your gateway also needs to be able to mediate between what you're exposing to the outside world and what exists within your enterprise. So you might have who knows what internally behind your firewall, but when you're facing or when you're exposing your API to the outside world, you're going to want OAuth. So how do I take an OAuth token coming in and how do I exchange that for a SAML token because my downstream SOAP service needs a SAML token embedded in a WS security header? These are the kinds of things that we see day in and day out when people are taking an API and exposing it. Attack prevention. How do you protect your systems from abuse? So how do you manage denial of service, different kinds of injection, SQL injection, JavaScript injection? How do you manage a deliberate denial of service attack? All of these things need to be built into or taken into account when you're looking at your gateway architecture. Caching and paging. How are you going to actually optimize your API for mobile devices? Maybe even on a global scale. So how can you leverage caching? How can you leverage maybe your existing SDN vendor to deliver your API around the globe? How are they going to deal with edge security and caching when it comes to an API? Last but not least, you need to figure out how you're going to manage quality of service. So how you're going to promise one group of consumers or one partner a certain quality of service and grant that to them, and a different partner a different quality of service level. So in other words, this is part of the licensing and monetization strategy around APIs. How do you create different tiers of service, and how do you manage those tiers of service? Then there's the developer portal, and again, you have two models. You can build your own from scratch. You can go out and you can fire up Drupal and you can start building a developer portal. And this gives you a lot of flexibility, but it is time consuming, and it certainly has a lack of integration with your existing infrastructure like a gateway. So if you have a gateway that is responsible for validating OAuth tokens and doing quality of service and doing authentication, how do you actually integrate that with that developer portal? There's going to have to be a lot of communication back and forth, because the developer portal is where the provisioning happens from a business to developer perspective, but how does that actually get enacted at the runtime? So you're going to have to figure out how to integrate these different components. The other option is that you can brand or integrate a vendor product into your environment. And this gives you a much faster time to market. And of course, it's well integrated with a gateway, assuming you buy the developer portal and the gateway from the same vendor. So the kinds of things you get in a developer portal is a self-service community. You want to promote innovation within your organization. You want to lower support costs. Interactive documentation. How do I actually make this API alive? How do I get people to see what's going on? How do I increase my levels of adoption? Everything about an API is speed. How quickly can I build the API? How quickly can people build apps to use the API? And how quickly can people adopt the apps? The pace of technology change is increasing every single day. And what we're seeing is that organizations just simply cannot keep up with it themselves. So building an API and building an API quickly and building an API that promises or lowers the friction in the adoption cycle of the API itself and the adoption cycle of the application is very important. I read a white paper the other day about OAuth. Not sure who wrote it, but it's all about how do the whole benefit around OAuth is lowering that friction in app adoption and lowering that friction in the actual adoption of the API. If you can release an API and people build applications quickly for it, and then the developers who use those applications trust that application and can actually allocate and designate trust through an OAuth mechanism, that means that they're going to adopt it quicker. And then when they get tired of that application, the next application can start again and deal with the fickle consumer crowd, and hopefully your API will get adopted and thrown into channels. So anyway, I digress. So app provisioning is another capability of the developer portal, integrated testing to speed up the learning, and analytics that provide feedback and measure the success, ultimately, of your API program. What APIs are successful? What statistics and analytics can you get out of it? What's working? What isn't? What parts of the API people are using? How much traffic do you have overall? What kind of successful monetizations are you seeing around the API? So if you look at how our products map to this, we have a lifecycle manager that does lifecycle management. We have a gateway product that is a gateway. And then we have community manager, which is the developer portal. That one is misnamed, I think. If you break it down, Lifecycle Manager is essentially an industry-leading SDLC governance platform. It integrates with the IDEs, the source control management systems, development tools, cloud platforms. It does workflows and approvals. It allows you to model your API from the top down. It provides you with templates for documentation, legal documentation, and the API documentation. It supports policy inheritance, and it describes or helps you describe what the policy should look like once the API is deployed into the environment, and it manages change and provides you with impact analysis. So literally on the top right there, you can see a graph. It's not a very good one, but it shows you exactly what parts and what versions of APIs, schemas, data elements, and apps are being used to actually deliver any particular version of any particular thing. And you can change it around. So if you're interested in seeing what part or where is this element of schema being used throughout your organization, you can do that by pivoting that graph. The gateway is scalable and high performance. It's policy driven, centrally managed. It provides you with orchestration and scripting capabilities. Very comprehensive security framework that does OAuth, SAML, it's a SAML STS, WS Security, WS Trust, OpenID Connect, all of the security standards that are being used or have been used in the past. And its real goal there is to mediate between the new and potentially, or the external standards and the internal standards. I don't want to say old and new because a lot of these things are still around and very popular. It also provides and manages quality of service and also provides protection, denial of service, antivirus injection, etc. The Community Manager product is a customizable developer portal. It's very flexible. You can go from turnkey, simple branding to a complete customization of a website or developer portal that leverages our APIs. So you don't have to use our user interface. You could go straight to our APIs and use those directly. It has integrated documentation for the APIs. It manages app provisioning and monitoring. It provides integrated testing via the Dev Console, provides you with license management that helps with monetization, partner and group management, analytics, forums, trouble ticket management, and a federation hierarchy that allows you to deal with complex organizations or consortiums. The model is very flexible, the deployment model. You can either deploy or leverage our products in the cloud. You can be a tenant, and we will basically manage and host it for you. You can deliver or install those products on-premise, or you can do a kind of a hybrid model. When you're dealing with things like orchestration, you may want that on-premise because it's chatty and you don't want to make so many calls over the internet. So you might want the gateway on-premise, but you can leverage the Community Manager or developer portal in the cloud. And that's it. Thank you very much. My name is Alistair Farquharson. I'm the CTO of SOA Software. And you can reach me there, or you can come to our website. Thank you.
Thank you, Alistair. I think he's trying to get you off to your sessions early, but I'm going to delay him to see if there was anything he didn't cover. I've never heard so many acronyms, so apart from anything else, someone's probably going to ask, what? But can we just do some housekeeping? These decks will be available, also Alistair. So if he's baffled you with those acronyms, you will be able to find them. We upload them to the schedule page if you're not familiar with that. So go back to our schedule page and you'll see a little note saying download presentation. It might take till next week, but that's what we'll do. Any questions for Alistair Farquharson before we go over there? Let's kick this off. I will come to you. Just relax. Just take it easy. And tell us what you want to ask.
What is your definition of your API?
What is the definition of an API?
Of your API.
Well, we don't have an API ourselves, except for the API that underlies our developer portal. But I think the definition of API is very, very important. An API is more of a business product than it is anything technical. So an API is basically a channel into your organization that drives revenue or drives some kind of a benefit. The technology does not matter at the end of the day. An API can be a SOAP service. An API can be a JSON REST API. An API can be WebSockets. An API can be Thrift. The technology doesn't matter, and the technology is going to change. So really, the only common thread through this thing is that you're building a new channel for your business, either to use internally or to use externally. And that channel is a technical channel that allows people to build applications against the core functionality within your business. There is no technical or hard and fast technical definition for an API that I can see. Hopefully that answered your question. No.
Hang on, let me just come so we can hear what this follow-up is. Then we have another question waiting over there. Hang on, here we come.
So when you say API, you mean your product as software, correct?
Our product is software.
Your product. It's just your product, that's all.
Now, our product manages businesses' APIs. So you would expose an API in your business, and then we would manage that API. So we would layer security and things on top of an existing API.
So not SOA Software API, but APIs in general. Next question is in the middle there. I've delivered the microphone, so please take care of it, and I'll come to you.
Hi, Alistair. So
Yes.
my question is, on legacy applications and stuff like that, right? I saw you have a product on mainframe SOAs as well. So, my understanding on APIs, if you're developing a new product, you think a lot about APIs, how you're going to make them, available to the general audience, or whoever your audience is. But in legacy applications and mainframe environments, that process can be pretty, cumbersome. The cost of developing new APIs to existing products. So how do you manage that kind of environment, or what is the incentive for companies to build those APIs for legacy applications and stuff like that? So just can you comment a little bit on that?
Well, the majority of what we're seeing is people are building an API first and foremost, and then they need to figure out where they're going to get that transactional data, where they're going to actually do that business on the back end. So in many cases, yes, you're right, they do need to somehow expose a mainframe transaction as an API. And they need to figure out what they're going to do in the middle. How are they going to mediate between that? Either they might already have an existing ESB or a WebSphere platform. They could write some code and they could expose a REST API that actually exposes the mainframe transaction. Or they can get a gateway like ours, which can mediate between MQ messages on the wire, using a space-delimited kind of format that the mainframe expects, and expose an API on the other side. So I'm not sure if that answered your question, but we do see a lot of that, and a lot of the mediation, and a lot of the transformation, and a lot of the orchestration that people need to expose or need to have to build an API.
Probably our last question is coming from my right.
This is a political question. We don't have to answer this, okay?
Oh.
In the past year, there have been acquisitions by CA,
Yes.
IBM, Microsoft, and Intel. The three players left: you, WSO2, and FPG.
Yes.
Who do you think is the next acquirer, next acquiree? Your speculation.
Whoa.
Who would be the next one?
To buy and to be acquired.
To be bought.
Oh, I don't know about that. You put me on the spot here.
I know.
I think that the most interesting vendors are the cloud vendors, in terms of maybe acquirers. I'll throw it out there. But I think it's really interesting how you can abstract the platform and abstract the cloud with APIs. I mean, you're consuming APIs from the cloud, you're building APIs in the cloud. A lot of development is moving to the cloud. So when you think about lifecycle management and software development lifecycles have moved from inside an organization to both internal and external. So now we're seeing people using Git, we're seeing people use all sorts of things that are outside of the organization. So lifecycle has now expanded out. Then you look at the gateway. And the gateway can serve two functions. Either it can be a cloud services broker in the cloud to orchestrate things that are in the cloud already, or it can be that gateway between whatever's on the cloud and your own organization. So it can be the landing pad for exposing APIs to the cloud. And then the community manager is all about how do I actually share these assets, and it can again be on the cloud. So I think that it's a natural evolution from cloud, or APIs are a very natural adjunct to cloud in general.
Agree. Thank you much.
So I totally didn't answer your question.
You dodged that terribly nicely.
You did.
You've got choices of sessions for the next 90 minutes, so let's get going on that. But one more round of applause, please, for Alistair Farquharson, SOA Software. You'll see them on the show floor. You cannot miss them. And